been a co-coordinator since Virginia. He thinks 4 years, but I'm pretty sure longer than that, because for as long as I remember. Anyway, he's one of our super volunteers, co-coordinator in Virginia, and he will be sitting down with Clarence Edwards to talk about next steps for climate policies.
Thank you, Sabrina. As you may have heard earlier, Clarence Edwards leads the Energy and Environmental Policy section of the Friends Committee on National Legislation. And he has worked for decades, both nationally and internationally, on energy policy. And as we were trying to plan this out, we decided to go with a prepared question interview format and see if we have a few minutes at the end for participant questions as well. So our first question, Clarence, is journalists sometimes comment that carbon pricing makes economic sense and it will be effective against climate change, but voters don't want it and most politicians seem to avoid it. So how should we respond to this?
Thank you for these questions, Chris. And thank you all again for coming out. Thank you for coming to your conference. Thank you for having me. Thank you on behalf of Sabrina. Thank you for listening to me today, when you have. I hope it's useful. Yeah, I noticed that journalists like to say things like, carbon pricing is a great idea, but it's never going to happen because of blah, 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 blah. And so I would say that two things. You can't say that voters don't want it, because I don't think that voters have ever been really engaged in a conversation specifically around carbon pricing. I think that CCL constituents, FCNL constituents really believe in the issue and drive it forward. I don't think that we've had a larger conversation. We've barely had larger conversations about climate in this country up until, 3 or 4 years ago or so, is when it's really gotten into the mainstream. So I think it's too early to say that voters don't want it. I think that there's a need for a real education campaign around carbon pricing. I said to a friend of mine the other day, I don't know how many of you all are on social media, but like a month ago or so, it was heat pumps. Every other tweet I looked at was someone talking about, not heat pumps, induction stoves. Induction stoves, thank you. Versus gas stoves. And it was just going back and forth. And I thought to myself, if you can get people this worked up over, stoves, and it's legit and all, but if you can have a conversation around how we're cooking, you can have a conversation that says, hey, it's all around us, this problem, this challenge. It's carbon. It's in the atmosphere. It's in this room right now. It's one of the basic building blocks. It's a challenge for us. We need to address it. We need to start an education campaign where we really, at the grassroots level, take the knowledge that you all have in this room and start having conversations. And I'm even thinking, there needs to be a multimedia campaign about this is why this is a policy that we need. Here are the upsides to it. Here's what a fee would do. Here's what a dividend would do for you. And let's broaden out the conversation. So I think it's great that the media supports, the journalists I've read seem to support it. But I think we need a broader conversation on the issue. Hopefully we're going to be getting closer to that happening.
Thank you. We have had a number of federal legislators who have seemed interested in carbon border adjustment tariffs in recent years. And this would be to force other nations to price their carbon. However, some of those legislators don't seem interested in pricing our carbon in the USA. How does this separation impact our path forward on climate policy?
I'm going to go back and answer the second part of your question about carbon taxes because it relates to this. most politicians don't like to, I don't want to say they don't like to engage with carbon pricing, but it suffers from what I call bipartisan ambivalence, where everyone kind of likes it, or both sides. Not everyone. A lot of politicians on both sides seem to like it, get the idea. No one likes it enough to really push it forward. Senator Whitehouse changed the calculus on that last year, pushing the his carbon pricing legislation, the name of which just went Save Our Future Act, which is very comprehensive. Carbon, methane, PM 2.5, addressed all of those. I think that politicians, I think a lot of politicians are comfortable with it, just like Exxon was comfortable with carbon pricing, and when someone said, well, they support it because they know that it's never going to happen. I think it's kind of like, yeah, sure, it's a great idea. But I'll say two things. Number one, we got the majority of Democrats in the 117th Congress. We were close. Democrats were close to putting a carbon fee in the reconciliation bill. I'll say number two, there's a methane fee in there. It's not huge, but there's a methane fee in there. That's a big deal. So, testing out the theory of the case there. So let's be watching, FCNL's watching. What happens with the methane fee? How does that evolve? When it comes to border adjustments, Senator Kramer from North Dakota and Cunningham from Callahan, from Louisiana have carbon border adjustments on their mind. And one of the theories being, one of the facts being that the U.S. is U.S. manufacturing is intensely low carbon. I think it's 40% lower carbon than most other nations. So a carbon border adjustment would allow U.S. manufacturers and producers to take advantage of that carbon advantage. I do not yet understand how a carbon border adjustment is supposed to work without a carbon fee. I have read that some people on the Hill think that the fact that we have regulations like Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, they feel like from a regulatory perspective we have almost a shadow carbon price. I'm not adept enough to figure out how that's supposed to work, but I do think it's interesting this Congress because the carbon border adjustment conversation really has a lot of traction, not just with Democrats like Senator Coons, but also, as I said, with Republicans. And what interests me about that whole conversation is I feel like it's a way that we're backing into the conversation about carbon pricing. And so it gives me a lot of optimism. It's going to be interesting to see how it's all hashed out. But yeah, that's where I am on the CBA conversation.
All right, next question. We sometimes hear the argument, quote, renewable energy is already growing fast, so we don't need any carbon pricing. Please respond to that argument.
I'm looking up a quote that I saw. It was in response to this, and someone said to me, what was it? Two issues in terms of, yes, it is growing, but number one, fossil fuels, I think our fossil fuel use is was higher in 2021, 2022, but it peaked in 2019. But so fossil fuel use is still a thing. It's still a big thing. And the two areas that a friend of mine texted me said, the power of incumbency in fossil fuels and the power of inertia are the reason why we still need to put money into renewables. Renewables are growing at I think at the fastest rate. Another thing I wrote down, because my brain doesn't hold all of this as much as it used to, but renewable energy energy generates about 20% of all U.S. electricity, and that percentage continues to grow. In 2022, solar and wind were added more than 60% of the utility scale generating capacity to the U.S. grid, 46% from solar, 17% from wind. Renewable energy is still growing quickly, but that incumbency that the fossil fuel industry enjoys, to break that, to push us away from it further, we still need to put as many subsidies and tilt the playing field towards renewables. It's still about a viable policy. And that is why a carbon fee and dividend would be useful to do that same thing. Continue driving, pushing fossil fuels out of the system.
Financial fairness to low-income communities is often cited by fossil fuel interests as a reason to consume their products. Progressives often brag about the low cost of gasoline when they are in charge of the government. And then they tell us that we need to do something about that climate change problem. Do these statements make sense to you?
No. But they do make sense because I've spent 20 plus years in Washington. So it's politics. I mean, you know, we have an economy, we have a civilization that was built on fossil fuels. And to make that change, both intellectually and physically, it's kind of a juggling act. We have to, you know, the president said in the State of the Union that we're going to be using fossil fuels for, you know, the foreseeable future. And I don't know whether it's controversial for him to say it, but it's a fact. And the challenge is, how do you recognize that today a lot of people, a lot of different socioeconomic levels, still use oil and gas? How do you balance that with the need to make this transition? So that's where a lot of these comments come from. You know, the moment gas prices go up 5 cents or so, it's funny to watch politicians like, you know, try to mitigate against that. And that's just, we train the U.S. public. Politicians have trained the U.S. public. It's very Pavlovian response. So gas prices go up, it's like, oh my God, it was Putin, it was Iran, or whatever. So that's just part of the way that U.S. politics rolls, unfortunately or unfortunately. When it comes to fossil fuel companies saying that their products are better for or easier for lower income communities or so, what was it exactly?
Repeating my question?
Yeah.
Progressives sometimes brag about the low cost of gasoline when they're running the government and tell us we need to do something about the climate change problem. And then financial fairness to low-income communities is cited sometimes by fossil fuels.
The only way that you could say that financial fairness, I get what they're saying. The only way you can say that fossil fuels are financially fair to low-income communities is if you ignore the externalities of fossil fuel pollution, which killed, I think, around 3 to 4 million people in 2021, according to a Harvard University study. Fossil fuels are only good for lower income communities or for anyone if you ignore the externalities, the damage to our human health, the damage to the planet. If you factor those in, then that statement doesn't hold any water or oil.
Is it possible to enact carbon pricing in a way that fails to get climate results and hurts people?
Yes. If the price per ton is too low, and it's going to be low if and when we get a carbon fee in this country, because it has an inevitability to it in my mind, it's probably going to be set at a level that doesn't upset certain groups. We have to start somewhere. But if it's designed in a way that, if there's no fee going, if it's left as a regressive tax, and that regressivity isn't addressed, that would be detrimental. if it doesn't escalate, if it stays low in perpetuity, then that's not good. So yeah, the design of a carbon fee and dividend bill, whether it's similar to Senator Whitehouse's Save Our Future Act or the Energy and Investment and Carbon Dividends Act from the previous Congress and Congressman Deutsch. If it's designed like those pieces of legislation, then we're going in the right direction. So the design of the bill would be crucial.
Thank you. My final prepared question. As citizen activists in 2022, CCL volunteers faced a crossroads with the passage of major legislation that missed by one vote, we believe, to include carbon pricing. As an ally for our organization, how would you counsel us to deal with this near miss and our chosen path of keeping it in our portfolio while adding some other new objectives?
I think that keeping it in the portfolio is really positive. I think that the fact that the carbon pricing community came as close as it did last year, and I'll be honest with you, it really surprised me. Like at the last moments, senators' shots, I think, in White House, and people were really close to getting it in there. I remember talking to one of my colleagues, and I was like, that's not going to happen. And I mean, I lobbied for it. And it almost did, so it's really impressive. So I don't think we should be discouraged. I think it's a good sign. I think that the other good sign is someone like Senator Mitt Romney talking in positive tones about the carbon price. There was a budget committee hearing last week where he raised it again. And so I think that those are good signs. I also think it's really good, and we're doing this as your allies in this at FCNL, I'm going to be doing this same strategy, where it's carbon pricing with the border adjustment, but it's also other policies. It's permitting reform. One of the strikes against carbon pricing is more in how it's framed sometimes, when people say, oh, it's not a silver bullet. And it's never, I don't think anyone's ever thought it was going to be a silver bullet. There is no silver bullet to addressing the climate crisis. It's going to take a series of policies. We've got a lot of those policies in the Inflation Reduction Act and in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And it's going to take another suite of policies. Carbon pricing should be, it's not the silver bullet, but it is part of a portfolio of strategies that legislative initiatives that we have to enact at the federal level, probably at the state level as well, to address the climate crisis. So it's good that you're focusing on permitting reform and forest issues, because it's a package of strategies that we need to enact. So I like your strategy.
So you would advise us to overcome our sense of loss and keep on working.
Yeah, it's a loss, but when I started working on this issue, a friend of mine was like, they've been talking about that, not CCL, but carbon pricing people. They've been talking about that for 20 years or so. And yeah, but how long does any piece of legislation, how long does any issue take? How long did passing civil rights legislation take? How long did it take us to notice the hole in the ozone layer and address that? Any issue and any policy with real belief behind it that you feel committed to. I know everything is about immediate gratification and blah blah these days, but it takes time. I don't want to tell you all this, but it takes time and commitment. Just because it takes a lot of time doesn't mean it's the wrong policy. And I think that we're getting close. I think we're going to have a carbon fee and dividend within the next 5 to because I think it's just going to be stunningly obvious. I don't know, hopefully this isn't on Zoom or whatever. But yeah, because I think it makes sense. I think, you know, it can return any policy that could take pollution and carbon out of the air, basically turn it into money that you can put in the pockets of Americans. I mean, it's gonna get the hearing it deserves, I think. And I think that domestically that's gonna happen because of groups like CCL and FCNL and other climate groups. I think it's going to happen internationally because I can't remember the exact number of countries around the world that have enacted carbon pricing, but I think Austria just did one, and Indonesia is looking at one. And frankly, the global situation is going to force us to, this is happening a little bit with CBA in Europe, it's going to force us to put this on the agenda. So we're going to push domestically, but also the international situation is going to push it onto the agenda pretty quickly.
So I didn't know, Sabrina, if we have time for any questions from the audience. Okay. Yeah, a few minutes left. Okay.
I sometimes think about the movie Amazing Grace about William Wilberforce, who in about the 1780s decided that Britain needed to stop participating in the slave trade, and he was a single voice. And by the early 1800s, he enlisted William Pitt, the youngest prime minister, and Parliament passed a law, and it was basically the force of, in this case, a single person who kept gathering people to him because it was the thing that needed to be done. And it's an inspirational movie, but it gives us the energy to think that, yes, these kinds of things can happen.
Amen to that. I mean, you know, it's funny, not funny, but it's just, when you sometimes you talk to people, it's like carbon pricing. I'll put it to you like this. I saw some story in The Guardian from the UK a couple of weeks ago about scientists who said that one of the ways of maybe mitigating extreme heat and the climate crisis would be to shoot a rocket at the moon or something and create clouds of dust. And I'm reading this and I'm like, if people think a carbon price is out there. And I mean, it's just, you know, so this isn't nearly the most off the wall. It's not even in the top 10 off the wall ideas. So when I read stuff like that, I'm like, we're fine. We're gonna lobby on carbon price. Because it's like if I were lobbying on like blowing moon dust into the atmosphere, I would be maybe worried about that. So yeah, to your point, throughout history, issues come up. People are like, we can't do that. We've never done that before. This is insane. So what do you mean I can't own people? You know, and then we do it. You open the window, things shift. Things have happened in the past 5 to 7 years. And not to get political, but honestly, in the 90s or in the 80s, if you'd said to someone that Donald Trump was going to be president of the United States, that would have been weird. So I only raise that to say, crazy things can happen. Carbon pricing is the least crazy thing in the world. Let's keep advocating for it.
I would add to your now brilliant analysis, Clarence, that you mentioned the civil rights movement, I think, or Peter did, but the point could be made that when in the 50s and early 60s, people started organizing again to try to end Jim Crow and restore the right to vote, they did not know that they were going to succeed.
Right.
There was always the possibility of failure, just as there is for us. but just because you haven't succeeded yet doesn't mean you won't. And it does seem to be inevitable.
Everything that hasn't succeeded, everything that succeeded in the past, and everyone, we all, I think all of us, many of us, well, I'll just leave it at me. I remember when the Berlin Wall fell. Like a week before the Berlin Wall fell, no one was thinking about the Berlin Wall going to fall. It was just like one day it fell. I mean, let's use an example bit alone. Stuff happens. It happens. Stuff that's crazier than a carbon price. You know? So that's what keeps me eager to. I mean, we ignored this issue for a year because other things were moving, but I immediately wanted to tack back to it because it practically, fundamentally makes sense. Making polluters pay, putting a carbon price on, and similar legislation around making polluters pay for despoiling the global commons is going to be looked back on as, of course, that's what we should do. And as I said, it's happening. I love the United States. I love my country because we always act like it's impossible to do things here. Meanwhile, countries around the world are carbon prices, this and that. It's just like, so we're not even talking about like Jim Crow or like dust on the moon or whatever. It's like this is something that's happened in 70 other countries. It's like, man, we can do that here, and we can be a global leader by doing it, stepping out, and really catching up with the rest of the world.
This is the last question.
I've totally just loved hearing you speak. It's been wonderful.
Thank you.
Going back to something you talked about this morning or touched on, which is permitting reform, and whether there's a carbon tax, the Inflation Reduction Act, if the infrastructure cannot be built out, it's not going to be effective. And as a lawyer, I have visions of courts, one injunction after the other, when any local group of a NIMBY type bringing suit against any expansion that's going to take place. And court proceedings can take a long time, like years, decades. In terms of permitting reform, do you have any thoughts as to what can be done to address that or any other thing that allows reasonable consideration, people's voice to be heard without just stopping everything in its tracks?
I'm going to send this report from Brookings. This thing makes me want to sing, and I can't sing. I'm going to send this report to Brookings to Sabrina to share with you all because it was really interesting to me. It really got to mentions the fact that you don't necessarily need to open up and redo NEPA entirely to really get permitting reform going. You do need to fund the agencies that are in charge of these, particularly staffing at Department of Interior. There are a lot of ways to speed the process along, or speed is probably the wrong word, to accelerate it a little bit. But it's a problem at the federal level, but it's also going to be, the NIMBYism at the state and local levels is going to be, I laugh because I was thinking about this story out of California where UC Berkeley basically had to rescind admissions letters for part of their incoming class because they couldn't build enough. The dorms they were going to build got caught up in a permitting process locally. And so, and then you got that power line from Quebec across Maine that got stopped. So I'm kind of staying away from permitting reform a little bit this year. I'll probably do whatever CCL does on it, mainly because it's. I have no good answers on it, but I know that it needs to be done, and it really needs to be done if we're going to. $369 billion in the IRA was great for us to all support and get behind, but if we can't build it fast enough, then we're going to have a big problem. And I don't know how to unpick that. I do know that Garrett States just introduced a bill looking at modifying NEPA. There's other legislation percolating out there. It's probably going to be a big battle in Congress over the next few months or so. I wish I had some pat answer, but it's so complex. And the one thing I will say is that we're not going to get involved deeply into the FCNL, but we're going to keep an eye on it in terms of making sure that communities that are concerned about, environmental justice communities are worried about this, because reform has the potential to really end up doubling down on the pain that those communities experience. We want to keep an eye on it just to make sure that those communities don't get trampled on, and that the environment doesn't get trampled on. And that's what makes it hard. Balancing out everything that we need to build in this country to achieve our climate goals and protecting the environment at the same time is going to be a wicked problem. It is a wicked problem. So that's why we want to keep an eye on it, so that people in the planet are protected at the end of the day.
Well, I think we've gone beyond 5:30, so
Do not let me stand in the way of dinner.
We just have one more thing, or a few more things to address. Can we get the slides, please? We're gonna prompt to release you at dinner. Sorry guys, sorry we can't sit you away. Sorry about that. We're gonna try and get you guys out of here and ready for dinner. At CCL, we really are all about respect, appreciation, and gratitude, and so it wouldn't be a CCL conference without taking a minute to just appreciate everything that's possible. And I'm just gonna click through these guys because I know you guys are hungry. But there was really a lot of people that made this possible. Our speakers, moderators, our tabling sponsors, the College of New Jersey and staff, especially Barry, that's been doing our tech all day. Our volunteers on the planning committee, we had over a dozen volunteers meeting weekly for the last few months to make sure we were ready for today. They were key to making it, and just a big appreciation for Sabrina for organizing the volunteers. And lastly, just everyone who joined us today. You guys took time out of your busy schedules to be here, and it's just really appreciated. Oh yeah, before we're getting there. Second thing we just want to quickly touch on is you guys donated your time today. We would just ask if you would consider making a financial donation. CCL donations really help CCL grow, provide training, and mobilize volunteers to take action. And there's a lot of things behind that. It's everything from digital outreach, so new volunteers know who we are and outreach us. All our staff that provide great training videos to help you guys feel empowered and knowledgeable to take actions, as well as just like the website and stuff. That takes money to run, and we just ask you to consider making a financial donation if you've enjoyed what we've done today. We're not going to try to make you angry, like you guys mentioned this morning. We're definitely hoping that if you're hopeful about what we're doing, to donate out of that spirit. If you do want to donate, you can visit cclusa.org/donate. That's one of the options. You can also contact our development team at development@citizenconvalley.org. They'll have a conversation with you, answer any questions you might have. And lastly, if you just want to meet with us, Sabrina and I, after the conference, just give us your name and contact information or a pledge or anything, we can make sure to get connected with the right people. And it's not, I guess one last thing I just want to mention on donations is it's not just like what you guys can do, just we ask you to consider your networks. We all may have friends and families that would be willing to get behind that cause. And if you do have those friends and families and you'd like us to reach out to them, let us know. We're happy to do so, and we really do try to do it in a hopeful manner. We're not going to like anger or anything. That's not what we're about. Getting on to the dinner stuff, the fun does continue tonight as well as tomorrow. Tonight we're going to be playing the movie Tidewater at 8 p.m. ET back in this room. It's like about a 42-minute movie.